study this morning is in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. I sense that the class in the back was combined with this class. Is that the deal? So those who are joining us in the book of Daniel here in the 9th chapter may not have or will not have the background that others have that have been in here, but we'll see if we can make it relevant to everybody concerned. Don, would you word a prayer for us as we begin our class, please? Amen. As I think we all recognize, or most of us recognize, that Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah served at similar times in history. Daniel was a prophet who was in the throne room, so to speak, not only in the Babylonian government, but also later on in the Medo-Persian government. Ezekiel was someplace in Babylon, working with the people, some of the captives. Ezekiel, he prophesied concerning the fall of Jerusalem, the ultimate fall of Jerusalem, which included the temple being leveled. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem, and he also predicted the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the southern Judah area. So I don't know to what extent they had communication. That is Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jeremiah. They may have had, runners that were communicated back and forth. But in the first part of Daniel, he predicts, how world history is going to play out from the time of the Babylonian Empire. Now, Daniel was taken captive in the kind of the first assault on Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He served in that government. He was probably a very young man when he was taken captive and was selected by the authorities to help out in the government of Babylon. And then, for whatever reason, and however it worked in the providence of God, then he transitioned into the Medo-Persian government and was there when Darius the Mede was in charge of when Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, was there, and then when he transitioned into the Medo-Persian Empire, he served Darius and Cyrus, and may have served beyond that. But the time that this vision here in the ninth chapter of Daniel took place, Daniel was probably in his 80s. So he had a lot of history. In fact, he had more history probably than the kings themselves of Babylon and so on. Now, in the ninth chapter, Daniel is the first part of the chapter 19. He has a prayer. He's imploring God to, among other things, get the Babylonians, get the Jews back into Jerusalem. And so that's the first part of Daniel 9. And then he has this vision about the coming Messiah. Whether Daniel understood all about the vision, we don't know. But he had this vision about as it played out in world history, about the Messiah and the efficacy of the Messiah and what was going to happen to the Jewish people. And one of the things that we'll note in here is that he's prophesying the Roman assault on Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, previously, by a couple of different illustrations, Daniel was a predictor, prophesied about world history up through the time of the beginning, up through the time of the Roman Empire. He talked about that, that colossal man, the head of gold, shoulders of silver, belly of brass, the thighs of brass, and then the iron kingdom mixed with miry clay, depicting the Roman Empire. So he predicted the rise of the Medo-Persians. He predicted the rise of the Grecian Empire, and then the Roman Empire. Now, and so, he was a predictor of world history, of how this was going to play out. And so in chapter 9 then, he is there during the very beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, when Darius and the Mede and Cyrus, the Persian, those two powers came together for whatever reason and formed the Medo-Persian Empire. And so it was in the first year of Darius. Now, chapter 8 related to something happened during the reign of Belshazzar in the Babylonian Empire. But this dream, this prayer, came at a time when Darius was in power. Chapter 9, verse 1, in the year of Darius, the son of Asharias, of the seed of the Medes. So the first leader of that group, that new Medo-Persian Empire, was a Mede. Well, then Cyrus was a Persian, and the power really fell to the Persians in that empire. The first year of Darius, the son of Asharias, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were kind of another name for the Babylonians, or a class of the Babylonians. And so he says, in verse 2, the Bible says, in the first year of his reign, that is the reign of Darius, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Now, you wonder, as I indicated before, you wonder what kind of communication they had. Well, Daniel must have had some paper or communication, because he identified that Jeremiah had said that they would be in captivity for 70 years. And if we go back to Jeremiah, we see that coming to pass. I believe in the 25th chapter, 11th verse, and this whole land shall be a desolation, Jeremiah is saying. And that's the same thing that Ezekiel was saying when Ezekiel was taken captive in one of the raids of the Babylonians, and Ezekiel and Jeremiah were predicting the same thing. Jeremiah in Jerusalem, Ezekiel in Babylon. So in verse 11 of Jeremiah 25, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, Daniel spent most of his life in the foreign land, and in the government of the Babylonians, and then the Persians. So Daniel was reflecting on what Jeremiah prophesied, and it's verse 12, and it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for the iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it a perpetual desolation. Now, when the Jews went into captivity, what do you suppose the world was thinking about the Jewish God, Jehovah? Pardon me? Yeah, thinking this was a great embarrassment to the Jews to be in captivity. I mean, the chosen people of God, the people for 1,000 years. It had been 1,000 years here from the time that God led the children of Israel across the Red Sea, headed toward the Promised Land. So for 1,000 years, the world, the contemporary world, knew something about, the Jews and the Jewish God. And so when the Jews were taken in captivity, then the world community was thinking, well, the Jewish God is no different than the idols of the various nations, you see. So it was this, and of course, laced throughout Jeremiah, there's this prediction of a 70-year reign, or a 70-year captivity, where Jews would be subject to other kings that are foreign kings that are reigning at the time. And so we could spend a lot of time in Jeremiah emphasizing Jeremiah's prediction. But moving back to Daniel, the 9th chapter. So, and again, verse 2, in the first year of the reign of his reign, you think about this. Babylonian government ended with Belshazzar, and it was during that the dream that Belshazzar had, that or not the dream, the handwriting on the wall, right? And Daniel was there with the last king of Babylon. He interpreted what that handwriting on the wall was, and then he, then the the Medo-Persian people took over, and here we have Daniel now. He's in that Medo-Persian community. Daniel must have had a terrific, we might say a terrific, a lot of stuff on his plate. Now think about this. Serving those kings would not have been easy, would it? I mean, serving in government, particularly a foreign government, probably was taxing him. Well, then he's got, through the workings of and the providence of God, he's dealing with really important and intense visions with regard to what God's plan for the world was, and thinking about and meditating on, here's these various world empires are going to change over time, but ultimately these visions had to do with the coming Messiah. I mean, that was the purpose for all these prophecies with regard to these various world empires. So he was there contemplating Jeremiah's work, and we'll read that again. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books, some kind of communication by writing, the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, think about that for a moment. Daniel is going to predict about a desolation of Jerusalem during the Roman period. And Jesus referred his disciples, and he quoted Daniel about the coming desolation of Jerusalem. So this all fits together. And he says, and he's saying, I assume he's saying, well, I've been here, I was taken captive about 70 years ago, about 7 decades ago, and it's about time that God, releases his people from captivity, because that was prophesied, by Jeremiah. Well, you suppose Daniel was wondering, well, is this really going to happen? Will the Jewish people, will his comrades really get back to Jerusalem? I don't know whether he had any doubts about that. He may have had some doubts, but at least he's going to pray about it. Now, if he really, I'm sure he believed that God would keep his promise, but then why would he pray about it? Why would he implore God? Well, that's part of what prayer is about, isn't it? And he says, I set my face unto the Lord God, and he had done that, according to the record, all his life in Babylon, and now in the first year of the Medo-Persian group. And I set my face into the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplications. What's supplications? How's that different from prayer? Or is it just an expression of prayer? Well, he's asking a request. Supplication would be a request, with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. Now, had Daniel been, had he been a person of prayer? Well, if you remember what happened in the lion's den deal, remember? It was because of his prayer, his regular prayer habits, that he was accused of, something. He's accused of, in fact, he was rightly accused of not worshiping the king. And he was, his enemies caught him praying. But this seems to me that it was an extraordinary kind of communication to God, a prayer to God, because it was done with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. What's that sackcloth business all about? Sackcloth and ashes. When people were really disturbed in that era of time, what'd they do? Put ashes all over them. They didn't keep themselves, and they had the sackcloth had to do with, I suppose it was some kind of a gunny sack. Now, none of you know what a gunny sack is, or do you? It's not very silky. Okay. Sometimes the old women I shouldn't say the old women, the women in the farm community years ago, that'd be a better way of expressing it, used to make things out of flour sacks. And those flour sacks were kind of, they weren't silky, but they weren't rough. Yeah, potato sack. Yeah, burlap. That's, potato sacks now are kind of smooth and all that sort of thing, paper. But, yeah. So, and Paul tells us about the burlap. Not very. So he was really in an intense prayer situation here. Now, what did he pray about? I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession. Now, thought he was going to be praying about getting released, having his people released from captivity. So now, what's the deal here now? He what? He probably wasn't having doubts, but he was acknowledging why the people, the Jews, were being punished. Why were they being punished? For disobedience. The Jews had 1,000 years of history. They should have understood that Moses was right in the book of Deuteronomy. And what did Moses in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, what did Moses say about obedience? What's going to happen if they're obedient? What's going to happen to them? Pardon me? They're going to get blessings. What happens if they're rebellious? They're going to get punished. There's a reward in one type of relationship, and punishment in the other type, in an evil, a relationship that is not good with God. So, first in his prayer, he makes confession that, in our terms, for 1,000 years, there's been that cycle of punishment, of sin, evil, and then punishment, and then restoration. And here's this cycle. Jerusalem destroyed, or the kings of the Jews, and the Wednesday night class has to do with the kings, and all the northern kings were bad characters, and many of the southern kings were bad characters, and there was punishment, a cycle of punishment subsequent to evil behavior. So he's saying that I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession Now, what in the world would Daniel, with regard to what we know about Daniel from the book of Daniel, why would he be? He hadn't been, engaged in immoral behavior. He hadn't been engaged in any. He was in the very epicenter of getting people to understand the awesomeness of God. Now, why is he confessing? Yeah, Nicky says on their behalf, and he has included himself. He was kind of the epitome of what was good, but he included himself. I'm sure he wasn't perfect, but he's including himself in this confession. And he said, "O Lord, the great and dreadful God."
I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Please interrupt anytime.
well, I just think that one of the reasons he included himself, even though he was a righteous man, even being righteous, he knew of his own unrighteousness, and so he, in comparison to others, he was much better, but he still knew he fell far short. So he includes himself in that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, and as we said, he wasn't perfect. And I appreciate the follow-up there. That he, given that he wasn't perfect, then he includes himself, and he's just he's a Hebrew through and through, right? I mean, he is a Hebrew, and and I'm sure he was proud of at least acknowledged his, God's favoritism, or maybe not favoritism, but God's careful nurturing of that nation. And up till this time, it had been 1,000 years. And he made my confession and said, "O Lord, the great and dreadful God." Now, great and why does he talk about dreadful?
Well, I was going to bring that up. The New King James says awesome. And I get it, but those words are the opposite end of the spectrum of one another in today's language. Dreadful, awesome.
Nicky's pointing out that another translation uses dreadful, or uses awesome, with regard to dreadful, but dreadful's not a bad word for.
I said I get it,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of people who want to argue all the time.
Yeah.
This is their perfect opportunity.
Yeah, and it's that's a good point that some people forget about the dreadful aspect of God's punishment.
Well, yeah, because our parents did so wrong. What was going to happen was going to be dreadful.
Yeah.
But, you had an awesome life. You had a home,
Yeah.
food, clothes. That was awesome. You had to go outside and play.
And God, a dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him. Now, this covenant, what was it about? It was an agreement between God and the Jewish community. The law of Moses and the Jewish community. Well, he was dreadful in terms of his punishment, and that punishment was awesome if they violated the terms of the Levitical code and the law of Moses. With regard to God, said, "You keep my word and think good things will happen. You don't do it, bad things are going to happen." And of course it all comes back to be on an individual basis. God keeping the covenant, and each individual had to keep the covenant, and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. Now, we have sinned. Now, that's probably an understatement. They worship Baal, Astaroth, They were idolaters. The Jews became idolaters. They set an awful example. They were supposed to set a good example to the world community, but they were awful. Now, we think about this for a moment. In the book of Malachi, and Malachi was a prophet who prophesied, about over a century after Daniel. And what did Malachi say about the Jewish people? What were some of the things that they weren't? How weren't they keeping the covenant even after, the captivity and world history unfolding with the Jews being kind of a central figure in that world community? What did Malachi say about them? So, anybody, interrupt me. They robbed God.
They were immoral. They were putting away the wives of their youth. They offered to God the things that were lame.
But did they worship idols?
No, they
Nope.
worship idols anymore.
Yeah?
They still weren't serving God from the heart.
Right. They really learned their lesson about worshiping idols, but then they didn't learn their lesson about other things, about behavior, about marriage, about they brought the Malachi condemned them for bringing the imperfect sacrifices. So they didn't learn their lesson, just as people today don't learn their lessons about behavior and so forth. Verse 5, we have sinned and have committed iniquity, and have done wickedly, and have rebelled, and even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. And of course, all this had to do with the law of Moses, setting a standard of behavior, a standard of worship, a standard for living, and they violated those Mosaic standards that had been in place, again, for how many years? For centuries. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants the prophets. Well, what happened to prophets, some of the prophets that spoke the truth? What happened to Isaiah? What happened to a lot of God's spokespersons? They were punished. Think of the punishment of the weeping prophet Jeremiah, how he was maligned and physically harmed and so forth. And many prophets, of course, over time were killed as a result of trying to herald or trying to bring the Jews back to the law of Moses. So neither have we hearkened unto the servants, the prophets, thy servants the prophets, which spake in thy name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. These prophets were sent to the kings, the leaders, the rich, the poor, but basically their message was to the people of the land, everybody included, nobody being left out. Tony? Tony, I think what you're saying, do you think the prophets were vindicated in that apparently people acknowledged that they were right? Yeah, yeah. In a sense, all the prophecies and prophets were vindicated, and that's a good point. They were vindicated because what they were prophesying came to pass. And of course, that's how Jesus said, you evaluate, prophets, you evaluate teachers. And if somebody claims to be a prophet, well then, did it come to pass? And so your point about the prophets and the prophecies were vindicated because they came to pass. Jim, you...
I was just thinking, they prophesied, but a lot of times they didn't understand. Walking down the road, they didn't understand that God eventually was going to build the church for all mankind. They desired to look into it, according to the book of 1 Peter, chapter 1. They looked into it and desired, trying to know, understand, but God didn't reveal all those things to them. It has only revealed so much to them. They had to be great in a faith to go ahead and do those things that they did, prophesy like they did. They had to be true to God in order to do this. And I'm sure God blessed them, and I'm sure they got their reward for it. But they didn't fully understand the whole scheme that God had in mind. The book of 1 Peter tells us that it wasn't revealed until the prophets and the apostles of the New Testament finally understood what was the final plan that God had in mind.
Yeah. Well, Jim is saying that probably the prophets didn't really understand all of what they were saying. They couldn't grasp certain concepts and principles. They just couldn't. Then when you play that out, the lots of the prophecies pointed to the Messiah, and then that Messiah was for whom? Everybody. And so many of the Jews couldn't figure out that, well, even the apostles couldn't figure out that this gospel, this Messiah, was for Gentiles as well as Jews. I mean, think about that for a moment. Peter had to get a vision. God had to give Peter a vision before he went to the household of Cornelius. Now, why in the world would Peter need a vision to figure out that the Gentiles were worthy of the Messiah?
This was approximately 8 years after the church had begun on the day of Pentecost.
Yeah, a decade later, Cornelius is the Gentile convert, a decade after the church was established. So it's not only did the prophets maybe understand completely what they were saying, but the Jews, even with all this information available, they didn't understand some very basic concepts. The Sadducees were a sad group, right? They didn't even believe in the hereafter. They didn't even believe in life after an earthly existence. And of course, they were a political. The Sadducees, and I don't mean to get going down a different path here, but the Sadducees were a political group, more so than a religious group. And I think there's a lesson there for America and they brought the concept of Christianity in America because some Christian groups, some groups in America are putting forth a political agenda more so than a spiritual agenda. So, just think about that. We don't have time to go into that, but just think about how some of the groups are getting so political that they don't know what their mission, or don't realize what their mission actually is supposed to be. O Lord, verse 7, righteousness belongeth unto thee. Wonder why he would talk about righteousness. Could an Old Testament character, could a Jewish character following the law of Moses completely, could you think of them as being righteous? Somebody said yes. But could they ever achieve righteousness and be considered righteous? How does one become righteous? Considered righteous? Pardon me? I'm sorry, Peter. Being rightful, but you can't be rightful on your own.
He said being right with God's law.
Okay? Being right with God's law, but is there anybody that's able to do that on their own? No, it's only through the blood of Christ that a person can be considered righteous, you see. Well, anyway, O Lord, righteousness belongeth to thee, and God, in God's plan, people can become righteous, contrasting with, Mosaic times.
So then the answer would be no.
I think so.
Well, when you said righteous, I didn't realize you meant it like that in depth. I thought you just meant like were they listening to what they were supposed to do. That's why I said yes.
Yeah, and Nikki, I didn't make that very clear.
Bill, can I ask a question on that then?
Pardon me?
Can I ask a question on that then? In the Old Testament, it was a very hard law to keep. It wasn't a perfect law. As best as they could, did they not be righteous through their offerings and such, and keeping the will of God at that point? I know that it's not a perfect, that everything pointed to the cross.
Yeah.
But they still be righteous,
They could be,
keeping it as perfect as they could.
right. And the blood of Christ extended back. Is that right, Tim? Back to cover the folks. Pardon me?
Yeah, in Luke chapter 1, it says about Elizabeth and Zacharias. It
They-
says they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless.
Yeah.
So there was a righteousness that they could have, but that cleansing came from the blood of Christ.
And it extended backwards as well as forward. Okay? All right. Well, O Lord, righteousness belongeth unto thee, but unto us confusion of faces. Now, another way of looking at that, some translations use a different word there. Shameness of faces. Another way of looking at that. But unto us confusion of faces, as at this day, to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to all the Israel that are near and that are far off through all the countries whither thou hast driven them. The Jews going, are we out of time? My wife thinks I don't hear well. Okay. Whether when it was a shameful thing for the Jews or any people to be captured in a national slave of another country. They were shamefaced. Well, we'll have to pick up there next week.